welcome to Clubland. I'm Dr. Seth Tevil. For the last year, Clubland has been a regular newsletter, often 2 or 3 times a week, shedding light on the whole world of private members' clubs worldwide. It's an area I've been immersed in for the last 15 years, compiling a PhD on club history and writing 3 books on the clubs of London, past and present. But it's an endlessly fascinating world, and there's plenty of knowledge I come across which doesn't fit into any neat or tidy book. And Clubland is my way of sharing that. I'm interested in understanding and explaining that whole world from as many angles as possible. Culture, economics, history, literature, even business models, and sometimes just some really very entertaining stories. And I also find that even if you have no real interest in clubs, they can often shed new light on everything else. History, politics, society, even religion. They're a lens for finding out about the past, the present, and the future. And over time, I hope that the website version at clubland.substack.com is building up into a formidable resource to answer just about every question you might have about this whole hidden world. Who joins, who leaves, who staffs these places, and what happens. And what you're listening to here is an experiment. Think of this as an audiobook edition of Clubland, with some of my favourite articles shared with you on audio. In time, I might evolve it into a more conventional podcast and bring on guests for discussions and so forth, things I couldn't do as easily in the printed text of my newsletter. But for this first instalment, I thought I would share with you the very first new piece I wrote when I launched the Clubland Substack a year ago. It hopefully explains why I launched it and why I'm still keen for this to be a community with evolving ideas as we try to understand the past and how it made us today. Post-Napoleonic clubs. What was going on? Otherwise known as How My Spanish Clubland Jaunt and a Family Trip Home to Switzerland prompted ongoing research into the aftermath of Napoleon. Back in 2023, I spent most of December on a tour of Spain via its historic clubs. I knew Madrid and Andalusia fairly well, but I'd never actually visited the rest of Spain. So I combined this with a burgeoning desire to better understand Spanish clubland and to put together an itinerary of 12 cities which had between 1 and 5 historic clubs which I wanted to visit. I still need to publish a proper write-up of that trip, and this is not it. This is about one of those eureka moments that hits you when you get out of the library and see things in real life. And it's why, even when historic clubs are bereft of any surviving archives, I insist on visiting them in person wherever possible. You learn so much from seeing the physical layout of a place, how large or small it seems, how it connects with the other spaces, how people move around and how they behave. Above all, the feel of a place is something that has to be experienced. And that holds true whether it's just one poky little room or a vast, sprawling estate. And that's why I'm glad I went to Castellón de la Plana. It's not one of the big-name cities of Spain like Bilbao, Barcelona or Seville, all of which I did visit, with some gorgeous and stimulating historic clubs along the way. But those are the 3 Spanish cities outside of Madrid whose clubs are fairly widely known about abroad. This is typically because when private clubs are looking to add reciprocal clubs to their lists, many tend to be quite strict about only considering establishments with overnight accommodation. Barcelona, Bilbao, Madrid and Seville have the only Spanish clubs which operate overnight accommodation, so they are often the only clubs to appear on the reciprocal lists of clubs abroad. This has led to a widespread perception in the Anglosphere that there are no clubs outside of these 4 cities, which couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, Spain developed a huge culture of members' clubs in the second half of the 19th century. Like much of the Spanish economy, it was highly devolved, so that there was at least one major club in every sizable provincial town or city. By 1900, Spain had over 1,500 such clubs. Now, while their attrition rate in the 20th century was similar to that in other countries, that's about 90%, that still leaves over 150 of them thriving today. and many remain cornerstones of their local communities with small, by Anglosphere comparisons, memberships of 300 to 800 members. But they have extremely high rates of usage, with over a third of their members coming in every week to socialise, dine, cook, or, especially cooking for one another, reading the news and playing cards. Castellón de la Plana had one particular point of interest for me. It contains Spain's oldest club, the Real Casino Antiguo de Castellón. Now, while the club's commodious and imposing building on the city's Plaza Porta del Sol is a more recent construction, dating to 1923, many of the artefacts contained within are much older. Before I jump to my eureka moment, it's worth saying something about this handsome clubhouse, which epitomises the clubland architecture I found across Spain. There is an impressive main hall and staircase, which habitués of Victorian London clubs will immediately recognise. On the left as you go in is a members-only treble smoking room and a bar, while on the right is the mouth-watering Restaurante Lino Gastronomique, which is open to the public, a fairly common setup among Spanish clubs, and a good way for outsiders to get a sample of the architecture and culinary culture in these clubs. Lunch was inexpensive and delicious, and generously proportioned. Upstairs, the private club rooms taking up the rest of the building are labyrinthian. There is a theatre, a ballroom, a library, offices, multiple card rooms, and even a cinema, while the basement is given over to a complex of billiard rooms. One special feature, under lock and key, and the one part I wasn't able to photograph, is the Hemingway room inside the main tower turret, which features bullfighting ephemera and photographs of a visit to the room by Ernest Hemingway. But as I sat in the restaurant eating my mixed grill, a local speciality, and was enjoying my lunch, I pondered the curiously early foundation date of the city's Real Casino Antiguo. Clubs hit Spain in a big way from the 1850s to the 1880s. As I've noted, they cropped up in virtually every sizable Spanish town. A few outliers had appeared some 2 decades earlier, after the ominous decade of Spanish history, 1823 to 33. You get the Ateneo de Madrid in 1835, the Casino de Madrid and the Casino de Cartagena, both in 1836. And the Sociedad Bilbaína in Bilbao, as well as the Real Liceo Casino de Alicante in 1839. So this 1830s smattering of Spanish clubs came even though the first of the Carlist Wars, from 1833 to 40, was raging all across the country at the time. And then there's nothing more until the 1850s, by which time the second Carlist Wars in the late 1840s were over. So what intrigued me was why Castellón de la Plana, a perfectly attractive city, but not necessarily a strategically significant travel or trading hub, had a club up and running in 1814. And then it hit me. The end of the Napoleonic Wars. We tend to bracket in the Napoleonic Wars as extended up until 1815 because of the 100 days culminating in the Battle of Waterloo. But for much of Europe, the Napoleonic Wars wound down with the first fall of Napoleon in 1814, ending in his ultimately short-lived incarceration at Elba. 2 things were on my mind about the significance of setting up a club in 1814. The first was the context within Europe after the Napoleonic Wars. The Congress of Vienna of 1814-15 foreshadowed a wholesale restructuring of European states, borders and identities after the Napoleonic era, a process which went on for years, if not decades. It also meant a complete reset of trade routes and supply chains, which had been severely disrupted and in many cases terminated altogether by the French Revolution and then the Napoleonic Wars, which had particularly impacted Britain. The decade and a half after 1814 saw cross-continental supply and travel networks being reinvented for the first time in many people's lifetimes. This struck a chord with me because the previous summer I had visited a number of historic English-style clubs in my native land of Switzerland. The earliest Swiss clubs date to the mid-18th century, including the Cercle de la Terrasse of Geneva, set up in 1754, and the Cercle de la Grande Société de Berne and the Société du Jardin de Neuchâtel, both in 1759. But a flurry of Swiss clubs were then set up in the 1810s. the Abbaye de l'Arc in my home city of Lausanne, which actually had roots going back to 1691, but it was reformulated as a club in 1814. Then you have the Cercle de Marché of Vevey and the Société de Lecture of Geneva, both in 1818, 3 years after Waterloo, and the Cercle Littéraire of Lausanne the following year in 1819. Local law has it that these clubs were inspired by visiting Englishmen passing through Switzerland on grand tours, who encouraged the creation of clubs like their own in London, though this is a hypothesis I wish to test in the surviving archives. And it struck me that something was going on, not just in Switzerland or in Spain, but across Europe. In Italy, the Società del Whist Accademia Filarmonica cropped up in the English Grand Tour hotspot of Turin in 1814, while in Belgium the Cercle Royal Philotax opened in 1819 in another favourite Grand Tour stopping-off point, Antwerp. Back home in England, veterans of Waterloo created the first mixed-service military reunion club in the United Service Club in 1815, and the nearby Travellers Club in 1819 was the brainchild of British Foreign Secretary Viscount Castlereagh, based on his experience of the Congress of Vienna, and explicitly designed for members who had returned from the Grand Tours, as well as for the welcoming of diplomatic guests from abroad. If you go outside of London, what's now the Clifton Club in Bristol catered to the city's internationally connected shipping elites from 1818. The ensuing decade would see this process of clubism accelerate, including the United University Club for Oxbridge graduates in 1821, the Grecian-themed Athenaeum for those interested in the arts, and the Oriental Club for those on colonial service, both in London in 1824. In Glasgow, there was the Western Club, and in Manchester, there was the St James's Club, both in 1825. You find the Malta Union Club of Sliema for colonial servicemen in 1826, and the first of the Parisian clubs, the Nouveau Cercle de l'Union in 1828, not to mention the Northern Counties Club of Newcastle for Northumbria's aristocratic landowners in 1829. And visitors to many of these establishments which have survived will find a striking degree of cultural homogeneity which emerged between them during this period. Of course, given the strictures of wartime, the grand tours across Europe for English aristocrats had all but ceased from the late 1780s to the mid-1810s. But there's a good reason to believe that when the grand tours came back with a vengeance, they were somehow embedded within this European wave of clubism. Did the English travellers on these tours export clubs to continental Europe, as per the legend? I don't know, and I wouldn't jump to conclusions, but I suspect they certainly played a part around the assertion of cultural norms and the spread of fashionable mannerisms. Was Spain even a part of this process, or a mere outlier? The customary grand tour route involved an anti-clockwise route through France, Switzerland, Italy, Austria, the German states, and the Netherlands, perhaps with an extension to Greece within the Ottoman Empire along the way. While Castellón de la Plana is only 5 miles from the Balearic coast, it was certainly not a staple of most grand tours. Yet I am not sure whether the process of pan-European clubism was driven by grand tours. I wonder if it was as much driven by reasserted trade routes and entrepreneurs. I've already written about how the Georgian clubs of London were imported from prototypes in pre-independence North America and Italy, and how the early proprietorial clubs were driven by highly international and especially European staff and managers drawn to the port city of London. Early London club staff were Italian, French, Dutch, Ottoman and Portuguese, and depended heavily on imported international luxury goods to give these new clubs added social cachet. And the availability of luxury foods and wines and their consumption in club premises may have been as much of a driver. Going against this was the trend from the early 19th century onwards for clubs to be member-led rather than staff-led or proprietor-led. And the second major theme that occurred to me, and which I'm still trying to think through, is the effect on clubland historiography. The creation of British clubs over the ages has often been framed in terms of waves set around certain themes. The mid-18th century saw the reconstitution of White's, originally a fashionable chocolate shop come gambling den, as London's first club from 1736. And this was followed by the creation of the Cocoa Tree Club around 1746, Boodle's 1762, Brooks's in 1764, the Savoir Vivre Club in 1772, and Goose Trees the following year in 1773. We are then told that aside from a few outliers, there were relatively few new establishments of note until the development of a string of political clubs in the 1830s, and some 6 decades later, which followed the 1832 Great Reform Act. And this was then followed by further waves of club building in London from the 1860s, 1880s and 1890s. I've done as much as anyone else to promote this Whiggish narrative around the primacy of the Reform Act. It was the topic of my PhD thesis in my first book. But I wonder if I've done an injustice in simply waving away the significance of the 1810s and the 1820s. Far from seeming like an outlier period, there is plenty of evidence to suggest that some major cultural phenomenon was underway across the whole continent, redefining the boundaries of European culture in the post-Napoleonic age. And it may well be that the travellers who led this process were continental European as well as English. So, apologies if you've listened this far hoping for a fully digested narrative full of answers. At this stage, I really have only questions and hypotheses rather than answers. But it is a train of thought that it's been occupying my mind a lot lately over these last few months and years. I've applied unsuccessfully so far for a string of research grants, stipends, scholarships and fellowships to further explore the theme, but clubland history remains, frankly, a deeply unfashionable field in today's academia, and British universities are in crisis, which is a pity, as I think they're expanding our understanding. Expanding our understanding of how socialising trends evolved, for good or ill, has a huge amount to teach us today, from social cohesion and polarisation through to better understanding what has made the norms of, say, the hospitality industry. But as a work in progress, I thought it may well be the sort of thing that would be a perfect thing to kick off this new Substack as a first article. And as ever, I'm keen to hear thoughts and tip-offs for possible lines of research as I continue to mull this over. So, over to you, dear listeners. And that's it for this week's instalment. I'm ashamed to say that my line of thinking hasn't hugely moved on in the year since I penned that, though I have stumbled across a couple of absolute archival gems. But that's the nature of sharing a work in progress. And I always find questions eminently more interesting than answers, so I'd love to hear from you. And for more updates on this world, ranging from pages from history to the very latest news, don't forget to subscribe at clubland.substack.com. Until next time. That was Clubland, and you've been listening to HMS Pinafore by the D'Oyly Cart Company, conducted by Malcolm Sargent.